Hi, Michelle Coon here, and welcome to Hidden Gems in the History of Music. Today I have a guest, Bill Coon, my brother. He's a well-known jazz guitarist, arranger, composer, teacher, and he's out in Vancouver. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
So I thought it might be really fun to talk about differences and or similarities between jazz, you're a jazz musician, and classical music. Because there don't seem to be a lot of people who are able to bridge the gap and play well both. Does that make sense? In both genres, both worlds. Okay, so first of all, I'd love to know more about the history of jazz. I know it's not been around that long, maybe like 100 and so a few years. So how did jazz start?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about so one of the many interesting things about jazz is that the history of jazz follows the history of recorded music. So whereas classical music is largely, but not completely, a written tradition, jazz is largely, but not completely, an oral tradition. And so of course there are big bands that read music, and that's certainly important, but that's not how jazz developed. It developed in a way where people had to learn songs by heart, and that tradition still exists today. For example, I teach my students how to play a song like Stella by Starlight, and they need to learn that song, the melody, the chords, how to improvise on it. And so if they go to a different country and there's a jazz scene there, and they go to a jam session, they can play that song in a jazz style with people that they've never met and people who may not speak the same language. So that's a big part of it.
So it's interesting because it's very different than classical, but very much the same in the sense if I go to a different country and I bring my music, put it down in front of let's say it's a flute duet, with another flutist, we can both play it.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yep. Yeah, so the music is a universal language for sure. And I guess the history of jazz, is in American music. Some people call it American classical music. Some people call it different things. Some people don't like the word jazz. Famously, Miles Davis hated the word jazz.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but it's improvised music based on an African American tradition, and it's now played the world over. And I think probably we would spend a long time if I tried to explain the entire history of it, but I think that part about it being an oral tradition is kind of interesting. And it's a very rich history, and because it follows the history of recorded music, we can actually listen to the history of jazz. Right,
that's pretty cool.
Which is a little bit different than the history of classical music, which of course is much longer. There's no recording devices during Bach's time.
Right.
So we can't hear him play the music.
We can only guess what it sounded like. I mean, we know what the word things were, but what he played like, what he put into it, how he played.
Yeah, exactly how he played it. So of course there are many different people who have different ways of playing classical music, as far as I can tell. The way Glenn Gould plays Bach is very different than the way you could name someone else who plays keyboard music of Bach, but certainly he had a very individual style of playing Bach.
Right. Yeah.
Which might be different than someone else's. And so, but if we want to hear how Count Basie played piano in his band, we can go to recording and hear him play with his band, and that's kind of amazing in itself. But it's also what's important about that is that if we look at a piece of music, for example, we have music right here.
We do.
We can see that this music, how do we pronounce that name?
Gensmer.
So the music that we see here was actually written by Gensmer.
Yes.
And if you go to a jazz fake book, I don't have one here, but if you go to a fake book that has jazz tunes in it, the fake book was transcribed by a third person from the recording, and so we're not actually looking at Duke Ellington's writing or Count Basie's writing.
So it's the other way around. From classical, in a sense, Bach wrote it or Mozart wrote it. We play it, they played it, and then they write it.
And then we transcribed
Somebody else transcribed it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's many instances where I or other people have, learned music totally by ear and don't even write it down and then play it together. So that might happen as well. But so I always tell the students that the music doesn't really exist on the page. That's just a guide. The music exists in the recording. So if you really want to learn this music, that's the
Go
source.
to the recordings. Very interesting. That's really interesting. Now, you had an interesting word you used in there, improvisation. Now, I know that in music history, and maybe a lot of people don't know this, for example, Mozart, Bach, Handel, all those guys, Haydn, they would have had to be able to improvise on the spot from a melody. It would be more like theme and variations. They would take a melody and they would make variations on it. And it was an integral part of being a musician back in the day. And we've kind of lost that over the years. I mean, I don't teach I've never been taught how to do that. I don't know how to do that. So if somebody said, figure out a variation on this melody, I would have to sit down and think about it and write it down, and then I would come up with something, absolutely, but it wouldn't be on the spot like I think it sounds like jazz would be. You'd be, as a jazz person, you'd be like, okay, no problem, I just do this, but you wouldn't write it down. It might just be, even if nobody recorded it, it would be a once-off thing, you might never do it again.
Right, well that is the thing about the performance of jazz,
Yeah.
is that many times what you're hearing, you won't hear exactly the same thing again, ever, because improvisation is such a big part of it.
Right.
We were talking about this before, we were talking about the idea of, okay, you play the melody, and then some of the people in the band, if it's a small band, will take a solo, based on the melody and based on the harmonic content, the chord changes. And then you go back to the melody at the end. But that improvisation is actually longer, takes a bigger part of the piece than the melody does. And now, when you get into larger ensemble pieces, that's a little bit different. Big band or larger ensembles for jazz, that could be a different thing. But for small combos, that's always the case.
So you have small combos, you have vocal jazz, there's big band, which was back from the 30s and 40s era.
Well, I mean, yeah, in the 30s and 40s,
when it started.
I would say, yeah, mid, definitely, like people like we talked about Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Artie Shaw, and those people were actually playing music that was the popular music of the day. And so that's also a different thing about jazz, is that music was popular music in the 30s and 40s. And so if you wanted to go dance, you had to go listen to, you could go to a recording, but the recordings were not that loud. So generally what you were going to do is you would go to a club or a venue that had a big band, and that big band would be playing music and you'd be dancing to it. So it was definitely music that people of all ages, but especially young people, would gravitate to, because it was new and it was totally danceable.
Yeah, and so there wasn't really any pop music as we think of it now, like the Elton John. Well, if you talk about classic rock, the Elton Johns and whatever, and the Taylor Swifts of today, they didn't really have that.
Well,
back in the 30s.
They did, because Artie Shaw was a pop star.
Right. Okay. So so that was combined with jazz. So what I'm trying to say, I think, is pop music. What we think of as pop music now came out of jazz then.
Well, came out of many different streams of jazz.
Right,
Rhythm
certainly
and
didn't come out of
blues.
classical, but yeah, okay.
Right, rhythm and blues. Yeah, because that was for in the way that jazz was very often music about movement. So it might have been earlier on in New Orleans, played in a parade, so people would be walking to it.
Right.
And then that people would also be dancing to jazz in those days. But then it became popular, especially with recordings, when recordings came out, so people could then hear it all over, North America. They could hear these recordings, or they could hear them on, especially the radio had a lot to do with it.
Oh,
too,
yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
So the radio comes on and people start listening to this big band music, and they get interested in it. And so, that becomes the pop music. And in fact, when you think about it, it was, when you talked about Taylor Swift, well, most pop music we think of nowadays, we think of as vocal music.
True, yes.
Right? But Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, They might have had a singer in the band, but it was not the main thing.
It was not the main thing.
It was actually instrumental music.
Interesting.
That was the popular music. And so out of that grew other types of jazz. Most importantly, the next era we talk about is the bop era, the bebop era, where all of a sudden, for many different reasons, because of the war, Second World War, there were less. Some of those bands broke up, so you didn't have as many people around, and the musicians got tired of playing the same old tunes, and so they wanted the music needed to move forward, and they gravitated to smaller clubs. And these smaller clubs, there wasn't actually room for dancing. And these younger musicians didn't want to play dance music. They wanted to play jazz, but they didn't want to necessarily play dance music. So the music got more complex and sometimes faster, sometimes slower. So it wasn't always danceable.
So did big band, which was the dance music of the day, essentially, it sounds like, did it kind of, I know there's big bands around now and they're great, and I think it's really quite interesting, like it's fun to listen to, but did it have a decrease then? It must have had a decrease for a while, or did it go out of vogue is what I'm asking, come back into vogue at all?
Oh, you mean big band jazz?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always been around, but yeah, it definitely during the, I would say, starting with the late 40s into the 50s, 60s, I mean, the big band jazz still existed.
Yeah.
But it was not nearly as popular. I mean,
right.
Some people talk about the Beatles as the final knife into big band jazz.
Well, yeah, that's where the popular music that we think of as popular music took over rock, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, really took over.
Really took over, yeah.
In the 60s.
Well, in fact, I know that for Elton John he says he was classically trained. So when he started piano, he started, learning the Bach and the Mozarts and whatever.
Yeah, right.
But he went that route to popular music, to rock, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You said something interesting that people would dance to and everything like that. But actually, if you look back at classical music, because they had no recording, so this is another place where classical and jazz are very similar. They had no recordings. If you had a wedding or if you had a big to-do or a parade, somebody, like I know Mozart wrote a lot of pieces for things that happened within Vienna or when he was in Salzburg for various functions.
Right.
So they would have, it was kind of the same idea, but they would be written down and you would have a little orchestra or a little group playing it for the outdoor or whatever. So there's actually a similarity there, which is interesting. It's just that it's not, it's in a different era, so the things that they wrote music for might be a little different, and there was no recording of it.
Right, exactly. And also, I suppose, earlier than that, even, what were some of those gavotte and...
right, those dances.
Those dances that some of the forms are based on. So yeah, there's the tradition of classical music being danced to, for sure. You can certainly hear it when you listen to some Baroque music, because it has such a repetitive nature about it.
Right.
I find. Yeah. So yeah, it's not like classical music was never danced to or never meant to be moved to.
It had more of the stage. On the stage, we're going to play the symphony.
Hey, we've got a dog.
We do. I told people about Jackson Earl, one of the first ones.
Nice.
Hello, Jackson. Yes.
Yeah. Do you like jazz? Do you like classical music?
Because for a long time when I was younger, because when you're young, when you're in your 20s, you're not worldly. You really aren't. And you really see things kind of more in black and white, and you don't understand all the shades of gray in the world, I think. So I thought, well, there's jazz and there's classical. And I don't like jazz. Well, I'm not saying that. But at that time, I was all focused on the classical, right? And of course, I feel much differently now. There are things in jazz I really enjoy. I enjoy vocal jazz, many of the songs. I enjoy some big band stuff. I personally, I think that music has to move you to really be into it, right? So some of that, when you guys get into all these solos and improvising and stuff, to me it goes off in these places that either confuse me or doesn't do anything for me. So it doesn't mean it's bad at all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it doesn't do it for me.
Absolutely.
Whereas you might listen to a Mozart concerto and I'm like, oh my God, I love it. And you're going, okay, yeah, I can see it's good, but not really doing it for me, right?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, of course, there's certain music is such an individual experience.
Yeah.
Right? It's so individual. And so Yeah, and what I kind of remember when you were younger, that I was, because we were both into our things and as young people, and I was like, well, I'm going to try and get Michelle to like jazz. So I would try to find music that you might like, and I remember once either giving you or lending you an album called the MJQ, the Modern Jazz Quartet.
I think, yes, I remember that.
And your listeners might want to know a bit about the Modern Jazz Quartet. They're an amazing quartet, of course, 4 people, and they integrated classical music into their compositions. John Lewis did a lot of the composing for that band, pianist. And so I thought, well, this is perfect, right? Because Michelle will hear the classical music in the jazz and instantly love the jazz. So I remember giving you that album, and then I said, so what do you think? She said, yeah, not really. Didn't really do it for you.
Didn't really do it for me.
But it was okay. I sort of understood at that point that maybe that wasn't going to be, the way you were going to go.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's interesting we grew up in the same house, but we had completely different loves of music, of what kind of music we love. Although there is that middle ground, like the Beatles.
We both love the Beatles.
Both love the Beatles. Yeah. Well, we've played a few things together. We played a Bach invention.
Yep, that's true. I do play Bach myself. Not in the public. No one's ever going to hear that. Well, maybe for a few friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we played a Bach invention, and then we also, what else did we do?
Well, we played that thing for Mom's 90th birthday, except I couldn't get we only had an hour before we were supposed to play it, so I didn't really get the feel of it. You said, okay, we'll play it just straight. Right, remember? Straight.
Yeah,
no fancy, jazzy stuff.
Was that some of the Page Quartet?
No, that was the other one for her 80th.
Okay.
Yeah, that was gospel music, just the Page Quartet. Anyway, they were a quartet made of our grandfather, uncle, and cousins.
Yeah.
And hey, we can actually
Local quartet.
let's listen to a little bit of that.
Let's do that.
Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
Well, Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Well, Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. God knows it. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Well, Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. You may talk about your man of Gideon, you may talk about your man of Saul. There's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. God knows it.
Okay, so that's a whole other kind of music that has nothing really to, or does it have nothing to do with jazz? I don't know, because it's like gospel-y, barbershop quartet-y, lovely harmonies.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
I've never been able to explain exactly how, like pigeonhole that music in terms of what style we're going to call it. But we grew up with it, so obviously there's that, and we can hear our our family's voice, our voices in that, and it really means something to us. Quite beautiful. And those, they were not professional musicians, but they sounded
amazing. Yeah, they did. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. I just thought we'd take a little detour there. Now, the whole thing about improvisation, when you teach, and like I said, we don't do it in classical anymore, maybe because we have so much music we can play anyway, maybe because there is now recorded music, we can listen to so much music, we don't have to make more of our own. I don't know why we don't do it anymore, and I'm not sure exactly when it ended. Although I do know in the 1800s, there was a very big movement or whatever. A lot of people wrote theme and variations. I wonder if they started to write those things down. I just thought of that now. But anyway, classically speaking. But as a jazz musician, how do you teach your students to improvise? Like, so if I came to you, I've never improvised. I'm like, okay, how do I do that?
Right, that's a good question. First of all, you need to be improvising on something.
Right.
There's also free improvisation where you might be improvising simply by reacting to the person you're playing with.
Oh, like
that's possible.
Like you hear something and you take that and do something with it.
Absolutely,
okay.
That's a form of improvisation, and that is even in more traditional improvisation that happens. So, for example, I would play a solo, and then you heard something in my solo that you might like, some melodic idea, rhythmic idea, and you might take that and run with it in your solo. You can hear. It's often something happens where maybe I would end my solo, and you would take that last idea of the ending of my
Okay,
solo
yeah.
and continue it.
Hmm.
So in that way, jazz is very conversational.
Right, I like that.
But your question was about improvising. How do you learn improvising? So the idea would be to start by learning songs. So we learned some of the more simpler standards, some of the easier Duke Ellington standards, some 12-bar blues.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so we might learn a tune like All Blues, which is a Miles Davis composition, and it's based on the 12-bar blues.
So let's listen to that
So
for a sec.
3/4 time.
3/4 time. Okay, let's listen to that for a sec. Okay, so you might start with this melody here.
Yeah, and then you would take the form of that melody and learn how to improvise on it, using both the melody as a means of improvising and the chord changes. So for example, you'd have to know, okay, in the key of G, then what notes can I play that make sense in this piece? And then as the chords change, you would have to adjust your notes accordingly. So you have to follow the harmony and in part use the melody to improvise. But it's interesting we've taken this particular piece because here's one of the most amazing differences between classical and jazz.
Okay.
Is that harmonically.
Yeah.
Would your listeners want to talk about harmony a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, so you in a key center, we talk about G major,
Right.
1 sharp.
Yep, we got that too.
Okay, so but the first chord of this tune we just listened to is G7.
G7.
G7, and that
So
is
1/7. I would say a 1/7 chord.
1/7 chord. That is the tonic sound.
Oh.
And so there's no, as far as I know, there's nothing in, you maybe can correct me, there's nothing in classical theory that will justify a 1/7 chord as a tonic feeling. But,
Right.
listen to Muddy Waters, listen to the early blues men. That's what they played. They established that sound. And having established that sound, rhythm and blues, soul music, rock and roll, etc., all use that idea. And you still use it to this day.
Interesting.
So they kind of took that sort of classical idea of theory and turned it on its ear in a sense.
Right. Because I can hear something and I'll like, those are nice jazz chords. Like I know they're jazz chords because they're not chords I know. Like I know if they are, but you know what I mean. They're not something I would use if I was doing an arrangement of something.
Mm-hmm.
They would be like outside the classical, common practice theory harmony.
Yeah. So to continue this idea of how to improvise, you would start with a song, learn the chord changes, learn the melody, and then very importantly start to get your feet wet. Like you can't learn to swim simply by talking about what the strokes are.
Right.
You need to get in the water and just be in a situation where you're not going to drown, but where you're going to be supported and you're playing with other people. That's very important. So you're reacting and playing with other people at the same time, sort of getting that idea of how to do what your role is. If you're a pianist, that would be a different role than if you're a saxophone player, etc.,
Right.
etc., or a vocalist. young people who want to learn about jazz, we put them in combos, small combos, and we coach them and help them out. And where I teach at Capilano University, every 2 weeks these small combos would have a recital and they would play for each other, and I would give them feedback.
So, okay, so if you have an ensemble of, say, 4 people,
Yeah.
and they're just learning how to improvise, they've learned the melody,
Yeah.
they know the chord changes,
Yeah.
and so they play the melody together, so the idea maybe at first.
Yeah, so for, say it was a vocalist and a sax player, pianist, drummer, and a bass player.
Okay.
So the vocalist and the sax player would probably play the melody, and the rhythm section, the
Okay,
bass player,
right.
drummer, and pianist would provide the harmonic and rhythmic foundation for that. Yeah, they could play the melody too. That's
Okay.
possible. But generally, if you're in a group like that, the other guys would play the melody.
So then if you're going to improvise, the singer, the vocalist would maybe for the 12, you're talking about 12-bar blues, so there's 12 bars. So for 12 bars, they would take that and kind of fiddle with it or whatever. They would,
Choice of words.
well, they would try to make something out of it that's a little different, but following the whatever.
Yeah,
and then the form, and then maybe the did you say saxophonist would do it? But would the pianist ever do that?
Yeah, pianist
Okay.
would do the same thing. The bassist would do it, and then maybe even the drummer, or sometimes the drummer would play fours. And when we talk about playing fours, trading fours, the saxophone player would play 4 bars, the drummer would play 4 bars.
So he's rhythmically using rhythm of the melody and the harmony, and I don't.
Yeah. So
Okay.
as soon as the drummer plays, of course, usually everyone else doesn't play.
Right.
So yeah, it becomes a little more abstract at that point. But you still keep the form. That's the thing that keeps us free. The form, which is kind of rigid in a way. I don't
Okay.
mean rigid as in there's only one way to play the form. There's
Right.
many different ways, but rigid as you've got to keep to that 12-bar
12
form.
bars.
And then you can do almost anything over those 12 bars.
Interesting.
And they even talk about playing over the bar line or playing over the 12 bars, so that it feels like you're not even sure where the one is. But someone in the band has to know where one is. Hopefully you know where the one is. So that's the form is what kind of sets us free in jazz.
That's interesting. A couple other differences. So, for example, if I'm been to jazz, I've been to concerts and stuff, and so when somebody does a solo, let's say the guitarist or whatever, everybody claps after that.
Right.
Whereas in classical music, you wait for the 4 movements to finish, then you clap. It would be very wrong to clap in between.
Right.
And maybe because it's a whole thing,
Right.
rather than individuals playing, like you've got an orchestra playing.
Yeah, I think there's probably many different reasons for what you're talking about.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, I don't really know the whole history of classical music at all, but I would. For a long time, classical music has been played in concert halls.
True.
Am I right
Yes.
about that? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's been played in concert halls, which is a little more of a formal situation.
That's true. Yeah, that makes sense.
So where I think the jazz club, in a part, it comes out of maybe the church. So you've got a congregation, and you might have a lot of back and forth between the congregation and the minister or the pastor, and so there's always a little bit of that in jazz. There's
Okay.
a little bit of that spiritual essence in jazz, and I think because its foundation is African American music, that idea of gospel and the way that the black church would treat a church service sounds very different than a more formal concert setting. And
Right.
so some of that
Right.
has spilled over into the club
Interesting.
idea.
Yeah,
And of course,
yeah.
just the fact that you're in a club where people are drinking,
Right.
it's looser, and so there's more of an interaction between. So what I'm trying to say is, I guess I'm trying to make the comparison between that interaction between the minister and the congregation and the players in the jazz band and the audience.
Right. I get
And
it.
so
Yeah.
that interaction is totally encouraged, and actually usually helps the jazz musicians themselves play
Interesting.
better.
Right.
If they feel like they're being listened to
That
and being
makes sense.
appreciated.
That makes sense. Yeah. I'm just thinking, and as I sit here, I'm thinking, I would have a hard time improvising. But I think that, sorry, back to the improvising. I just think that if I actually tried it, and work. And I don't really necessarily want to do that. I have other things I'm interested in, but I can see how it would be you gain experience, and you'd know what you're doing, and you do it with more people, and it would become kind of like second nature. Like reading music is second nature. Like I can read something, interpret it. I don't just see the notes in the paper. I know the swell of the whatever, and I know what to emphasize and what not to emphasize. I don't just play the notes.
Exactly.
Right. So it's because I've had all the years with it. So
yeah, the expression is so important in the music you play. You know, you've got to feel like that, of course. Yeah. No, I'm sure that would happen. So yeah, if you want to, I don't know. It's like you said, it might not happen, but it might happen to some of your students.
You never. Yeah, I've had students who are interested in jazz. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, but you've got to, you want to take lessons with someone who knows about jazz, but then you want to get together with other people who play jazz.
Right.
I mean, that's basically Highland. There's a lot of trial and error, playing in friends' basements,
right.
And then until I actually went to school and kind of learned more formally. But it was just us in the basement with friends who we listened to the music and tried to make it sound like that.
That's interesting. There is the concerto where you have a soloist, and then they have a cadenza. Now that again is very improvisational.
Right.
They used to sometimes, like Mozart wrote a couple of his cadenzas out, but most of the time the composer or the performer would go up there and just play their own cadenza.
Right.
And sometimes they were too long. Sometimes I've read things where they're a bit of a diva or whatever a male diva is, and they would play for too long, it was too much, and everybody was yawning, right? Because they were the center of attention. So there was still that improvisation, but now we have so many written down that we usually pick, so and so's. We don't usually write them. I'm not saying they're never written down; they are.
Right.
I mean, never newly composed. Sorry, but there's a lot of them out there that we use anyway.
So in other words, so to get this straight, so if you're playing a classical piece where there's normally a cadenza at the end, you have an option to choose from different.
Yeah,
cadenzas?
there's a bunch of them written out that have been published and stuff. You can always write your own.
I wanted to mention something because I was reading this book this morning, The Letters of Mozart. Your book.
My book.
So thank you for introducing me to this book. And we were talking about improvisation in classical music. So this is from 1782. He's talking about his wife-to-be, and I always mispronounce her name. Constanza. When Constanza heard the fugues, she fell quite in love with them. So this is Mozart writing a letter to his sister.
And the Bach fugues?
She will listen to nothing but fugues now, and in that form, to nothing but Handel and Bach. Having often heard me play fugues out of my head, she asked me if I had ever written any down. So he played fugues out of his head, which I just assumed was improvising.
Yeah, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And when I said I had not, she scolded me very thoroughly for not having written anything in this most artistic and beautiful musical forms, and would give me no peace till I made her a fugue, with the result. So,
wow.
So the reason he wrote his first fugue down was because of his wife.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I hadn't got that far in the book.
Yeah, I was just looking through it. But yeah,
that's cool.
So the idea, and of course Mozart was incredible because he could imagine music in his head very completely, it reminds me of Rex Stout. I think I was talking about Rex Stout, who's a writer, and he would think about his stories, and then he would sit down and write an entire novel, apparently without any editing.
Wow.
If you can believe this.
Wow, that's
Mozart
incredible.
would do the same.
Yeah, no, he would, yeah. Very interesting. So what are you working on right now in your life?
Yeah, so
music-wise?
I'm always working on a variety of projects. I've got a solo guitar album that is in the works and almost finished. It's going to be put out on Cellar Live. And this album has just come out, Triology with Scott Hamilton. And Scott Hamilton is a great tenor player that plays in sort of the swing tradition of Ben Webster and Lester Young. And we had never played together. We had a really great time. We played 3 or 4 dates together, and then we made this record. And on the cover is a watercolor of a place in Italy I stayed.
Oh, nice.
And this is an artist residence. And I'll mess up the pronunciation of it. Something like La Machina di San Cresci, which was a beautiful place in the Tuscan hills.
Nice.
And so my piece that I wrote on this is called The Slow Road.
The Slow Road, and that's the name of the album
That's the name
too.
of the album. Yeah.
Well, let's listen to it.
All right, let's listen to that.
Although it was really nice. I really enjoyed that. And so you got the impetus for that from your trip to Italy?
Yeah, the reason I went to Italy was to write music, but also to see Italy, which I've never been to Italy before, and it's a terrible place. Don't ever go there. No, it was a great trip. I also went to a place near New Glasgow in Scotland and visited our ancestral castle.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll have to go there someday.
You'll have to go there. Yeah.
I'll have to go there.
Because our last name Coon actually comes from the Coon.
The Coon, yeah.
But you have to go back many centuries
Many
to find
centuries, yes.
So yeah, so it was inspiring to be there, and just to have the time to sit and think about composing music. But that piece we just heard was specifically written for this recording, so I was glad it worked out.
Oh, that's really great. That's really nice. I know I've just listened to that one so far, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of it. So that's really cool. Because didn't I meet Jody? I think I.
Yeah, you met Jody.
Yes, yeah. So that's pretty cool to actually know one of the people on the album.
Yeah.
That's great. And I think you're also working on some big band thing you're showing me?
Yeah, so there's a band, there's many, right now there's kind of a renaissance of big bands in Vancouver, where I live.
Okay.
And for many years, my wife Jill Townsend has run the Jill Townsend Jazz Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've written quite a bit for that over the years. But most recently, I've been commissioned to write for the Vancouver Jazz Orchestra, the VJO. And so the piece I'm working on right now is a piece called As Luck Would Have It, written by Sharon Minamoto, who's a good friend of mine, a great jazz pianist who lives in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And maybe we should listen to a little bit of that.
Yeah, let's listen to that.
Good idea.
Now that's fun. You know, I really like the kind of like the beginning part, and the other instruments would come in, and yeah, and you can really kind of feel the I'm gonna say bebop, but I'm like probably that's the wrong thing to say. Bebop feel of it.
There's definitely some bop language in there.
Okay, good.
Bebop language, and just so your listeners know, that's what we're hearing is not the recording, because
Right.
it hasn't been recorded
No,
yet.
yeah.
That is the Sibelius version of
Right.
that. So they're
Right.
fake sounds,
Yeah.
but it gives you an idea of what it's going to be like.
Yeah, well, that's cool. That's neat. So it's going to be performed sometime soon?
It'll be actually recorded and then
Recorded.
performed. Yeah, it's going to be recorded first.
Of course, recorded first.
Yeah, at the
Yeah,
end of the month.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. That's really cool. That's really great. So I don't know if I have any other questions. I just think it's interesting that there are places where jazz and classical intersect, and places where they're very different. Even though people tend to be a jazz musician or classical musician, and it seems to be two worlds, but they're actually, since they're both music and music is a universal language, they're kind of like as much the same as they are different. Does that make sense? Or as different as they are the same?
Yeah, and many musicians over the years have been inspired by classical music in
Right.
jazz and vice versa, right? We can go back to Gershwin meeting Ravel, and Gershwin says to Mr. Ravel, "I would like to have a lesson with you." And Ravel asks Gershwin how much he makes per year, and after he finds that out, he says, "Mr. Gershwin, I'd like to have a lesson with you." So there was a mutual interest there, and you can hear in some of Ravel's music, you can hear some of the a little bit of Gershwin's influence in that
interesting.
music, a little bit, yeah. So, but then there's also people like Keith Jarrett, great jazz pianist who has recorded some classical pieces, and we were talking about the great trumpeter, of course, just the other day, Wynton Marsalis.
Yeah, right. He did both.
And he did both, especially
For
at
a
the beginning
while.
of his
Yeah.
career. Yeah.
Yeah. So very interesting. Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about this.
Certainly fun. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Yeah, it's been really fun, and
Yeah.
I think Jackson doesn't usually come in like this when I'm doing this, so I think he just really wanted to hear what you wanted to say as well.
Yeah.
What you had to say.
It's definitely part of the conversation.
Yes. So thank you so much, and if you like what you hear, I know I haven't said this before yet, but press the like button and press the subscribe button. That would be great. So until next time, bye.